So the title of the talk is Beyond Representationalism, Rethinking Knowledge and Education, but really what I'm talking about is inferentialism, which is a philosophical approach developed particularly by Robert Brandom, the philosopher Robert Brandom, and he sees it as Hegelianism. So it's driven from a particular philosophical tradition. And I'm talking to a broad audience. So some of you I know here, and I know that you know quite a bit about inferentialism, and other people will know nothing at all about inferentialism. So I'm going to be dealing with some technical terms, but I'm not going to go into all the deeper technicalities, which when I first got into inferentialism took me a couple of years to get a grip on. So it's not something that you can easily do quickly. But I hope I'll give you enough of a flavour of what the approach is about. As a stimulus to provoke thinking about this area, I was interested in the concept of agency. Agency is not a very nice term, is it? What does it mean? You know, it's meant to capture somehow our free will, our capacity, you know, to be able to motivate ourselves and do things in particular ways. But I picked up on this OECD position paper, which is a project with the date of 2030 in it, where they're actually arguing that learner agency is key for navigating through a complex and uncertain world. And my issue is, how are they understanding what agency is? What does it mean to them? They talk about future-ready students need to exercise agency in their own education and throughout their life. So,
or you can just click through the little arrows down. Yeah.
Okay.
No, you can.
Got it.
Yeah.
Good. So we're kind of managing the hybrid as well, so hopefully it will work relatively smoothly. And what I'm concerned with is what Brandom picks up as he says is a representationalist way of thinking for the last 300 or more years. So he's saying we're dominated by this paradigm, this way of thinking about things. And he's giving a kind of critical take on that. I'm using his ideas to talk about education and to say that representationalism is a problem in education. But to frame that problem, I'm interested in an ongoing debate that you'll probably all be familiar with, which is the unsettled question of what should go on in schools, what should be the content of the curriculum. You know, we've got the contemporary review going on now. And as you're all probably familiar, there's quite a ferocious debate between often governments wanting facts to be taught and teachers who are actually on the ground trying to give people access to areas of knowledge, being really concerned with how students can get access to that knowledge, what's sometimes called epistemic access. I want to say that although they look like they're apart, in fact, both of them have a problem in that they lack recognition of the distinctive nature of human agency, failing to recognise our responsiveness to norms underlying representations. So that's a bit of a mouthful. What does it mean to say our responsiveness to norms underlying representations? And that's what I'm going to unpack today. So this is an example that Nick Gibb got very disturbed about. He said, I've seen a history lesson where they had a portrait of Henry VII on the interactive whiteboard, and they had to intuit from that piece of evidence things about Henry VII. He was enraged by this lesson that he came into when this was going on. So children were coming up with things like, Henry VII must have been rich, or he was full of himself. I don't think that's a very good use of time in a tight timetable at school. They really ought to be learning the actual knowledge, the story of the history. So he's seeing that as something that's typical of what might go on in classroom practice and highly concerned about it because feeling the students aren't being given access to knowledge. Why are the teachers doing this? What do they say? They're not emphasising knowing that. They don't want to just teach a whole load of facts about history, but they want to get the students into learning to work with evidence in ways that historians do. Of course, you might think to yourself, if you're shown a picture of Henry VII and you know nothing about Henry VII, do you have the resources to begin to intuit from that picture, to begin to work like a historian does? Or what do historians forget, or history teachers forget, about what it is they've already been initiated into that allows them to make sense of that picture in the first place? But why are they using these activities? Well, one is to engage students, to start from where they are, to value their opinions, and to allow them to construct their knowledge, building on a kind of constructivist argument. Often Piaget's kind of wheeled in to support these kinds of arguments, that trying to build their own knowledge structures. And so this has got implications for the knowledge that is actually going to be acquired. So what's going on here? Why have we got this polarity? Debates about knowledge concern content, the curriculum, but they also concern pedagogy. So my argument is there's an issue about representation and our assumptions about meaning, what meaning is. And these issues relate to profound questions about what's distinctive about humans and what meaning consists in. So two things that we might not dwell on sufficiently. One is, what is it that distinguishes us among animals as a particular kind of life form? And also, what do we mean when we talk about meaning? So the philosopher McDowell talks about our freedom, he calls it a good gloss on one notion of freedom, in terms of our responsiveness to reasons. And what does this phrase mean, our responsiveness to reasons? We're all responsive to causes. If a table was burning hot and I touch it, I'll have a reflex action. My finger will jump off. I won't barely have to think about it. But what is responsiveness to reasons? Well, in a sense, all of you are responding to reasons now by being incredibly quiet, facing me, sitting upright in a way that you're attending, that you wouldn't necessarily do if you were 11 years old in this very same context. You might be thinking, might be moving around. So you've been habituated to particular norms, which give you a form of freedom. They give you the possibility of being able to concentrate on something and attend to it and take it in a way that you wouldn't if you hadn't developed that particular responsiveness to reasons. And why do I use the word reasons rather than causes? Because they're things we've put in place. These reasons are not kind of universal, floating around, universal. They're to do with particular social practices that the norm is. If you're trying to listen to a lecture, you've faced forward and you sit up in a particular way, you put your legs up on the table and all sorts of other things. And you become responsive to that without even thinking. But if we brought a 2-year-old into the room, they might not even realise that they can't stop climbing on the table or something, although they would pick up something, wouldn't they, immediately walking in, realising everybody's silent and only one person is talking. So they begin to develop that responsiveness. So the interesting thing here is that, for me, is that contemporary philosophy shifts attention to what it's assumed that we share with other animals, to what it is that's distinctive about human beings. So I'm just going to show a bit of video now.
Right.
And I'm going to let you get the switch over to the video. And this video just takes a couple of minutes. It's very short, and it's just a provocation to get you thinking about how we might be different from other life forms, what distinguishes from other animals. So I'll just give Neil a few minutes.
Because everybody to cross their fingers at this point.
Yeah. That's to get you thinking about what the difference is. Does anybody here have any idea about what the Kyoto researchers might say is the explanation in evolutionary terms of why the chimp can beat the memory man? I should have said that the man doing this task is somebody who wins memory competitions, so he's meant to be much better than us looking at that screen with on it. And he is obviously not as good as the chimpanzee. So when this was on the news, the BBC said are chimpanzees smarter than humans at mathematics, because the chimp can beat him at this task. So what could have happened in evolutionary terms that the Kyoto researchers do have some speculation about that, but obviously they don't know what's gone on. Has anybody got any thoughts?
To do with a lot of animals see at different speeds from us. So birds see faster than we do, so they can avoid cars quicker than we can. So I wonder if it's something to do with just that.
So I don't know enough.
Sensory.
I don't know enough about that, but actually the point is, their speculation isn't to do with perceptual speed, say, in that sense. Although I'm sure you're probably right that there are differences amongst species.
I'll take a guess. Maybe because the monkey has less going on.
Yeah, less going on.
So it's just focusing on one thing. Humans, we're always thinking of everything, aren't we? So,
Yeah,
I would say less monkey time.
We always
yes.
we always have a lot going on. But what more could be going on for the human being that's not going on for the monkey?
We can overthink sometimes.
Yeah. Any thoughts?
Language.
Yeah. Who said language? Yeah. Why do you say language?
Well, we use language to communicate.
Yeah.
They don't, so they have other ways.
Oh,
So
God.
that's what the Kyoto researchers say. They say that they expect that as language evolved, and they give a neuroscientific account of that, they say that changed the wiring of the brain and the way it was working. And in effect, we could say that chimp is responding to something different to the human being. That's why it wouldn't relate to the speed issue. The chimp is responding to shapes of light, but the human being is responding to numbers. So they have a concept of. So one of the things that I'm trying to unpack a bit here is what is a concept for a human being. And of course, concepts are part of language. When we're using words, we're often using concepts as concepts. The question is, what does that mean? What does a word mean? What more is involved? So as you say, more is going on that's slowing down the response of the human being. But I mean, that isn't an account. That isn't the account of going on here. It's speculation in evolutionary terms of what happened. But it's useful kind of heuristically to think about these sorts of things. What distinguishes your responsiveness from your domestic animal, which of course domestic animals have been humanized. They have been domesticated in some way in terms of their responsiveness. So,
Sharon, can I just say, I think somebody is.
Can everybody mute who's online, because we're getting some noise? Thank you. Maybe Patrick. I don't think you're muted.
Oh,
I can
sorry.
see. Okay. Good to see you here, though. So what's the distinguishing thing here? Well, for Brandom, he makes a distinction between reasons and causes, our responsiveness to reasons, again, in a way. So if we think of a thermostat that responds to an increase in temperature by switching off, then we can understand the action is it's the outcome of a causal process, isn't it? It's just like billiard balls on a snooker table or whatever. But if we think about what's going on with the human, and this could apply to a very young child, when a human does the same act, they turn the thermostat so it switches off at a certain temperature. The human's response involves and requires reasons and awareness of what follows from being hot, i.e. what the concept of hot means. So the idea is that when we go up to turn the temperature down, you could think you do it in an automatic way. You might be on autopilot, by the way, and not even think about it. But to be on autopilot with anything, whether it's driving your car or whatever, you previously had to be in an overt, explicit way, aware of what you were doing and why. You wouldn't just be doing some kind of automated response. So even a very young child is aware when they're turning the temperature down, they understand what temperature is and how that relates to hot or cold. They're not just an automatic process. And of course, this comes up in debates about artificial intelligence and whether it's correct to talk about it as intelligence. What's distinguishing us as a life form from inanimate objects or other animals. So Brandom says, what is the knower able to do that the thermostat cannot? After all, they can respond differentially to just the same range of stimuli. So it looks like it's just the same thing going on. But the knower has the practical know-how to situate that response in a network of inferential relations, to tell what follows from something being cold, what would be evidence for it, and what would be incompatible with it, and so on. So there's a very rich context around that very simple act of turning the thermostat for the human being. And so it's building on this phrase, responsiveness to reasons. The laws of nature bind us by compulsion. So if the ceiling was crashing down now, we can't wish it back up. We can't do anything about those kind of forces. I mean, it's curious that I've chosen an earthquake, like you've had in these tragic earthquakes in Turkey, because of course, when you look at that picture, there's a massive amount that we can do about those natural forces in terms of the design of the buildings to ensure that they don't collapse and kill people. But in terms of the force of nature, we have to respond to that. We're responding to that by compulsion. But the institution of authority is human work. We bind ourselves to norms. So I've said you're all binding yourself to norms of how to sit at the moment and face the front and not speak and not fidget. If you're crossing a road, we can have norms that will govern why the cars would stop on a particular marking on the road. And that enables a form of freedom. So rather than norms being a constraint that's negative, they're a constraint that actually empowers or enables something. So it's very funny to talk about norms in a way, constraining, because we think of it as a kind of restriction on ourselves in some way. But of course, if you think about comedy, it only works because of the norms. So you have to have the norms in place in order to subvert them, to invert them, or to comply with them, or to assent to them. So the norms give you a kind of power that you wouldn't have without them being instituted in the first place. So when we think about schooling, we're attempting to recognise the rational capacities of our students. We too often think of meaning as directly conveyed via representations, names, symbols, artefacts, pictures, etc. Charles Taylor calls that the designative approach to meaning. It's like a picture theory of meaning. It's the idea that our representation mirrors what it is that it represents. Somehow it's accurately conveying it. And so there's an assumption that we want to credit our students with rational capacities. So there's an assumption that if the representation is well designed, the meaning will be self-evident to the learners. But there's a problem with this. Here's a particular example from a geography lesson where the teachers use something that you can find on the web, the Global Peace Index. Even the colours are kind of problematic, as you can see, when you look at the list of the countries and what those colours might have in a particular context in terms of meaning.
Sorry,
Somebody sent a message.
that was me, and I.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Sorry,
Sorry, I just got a bit lost then. So you can see that here's a visual representation of something that's being given to students. So much already is embedded in it, isn't it? Behind the actual words, behind the binary list, the heading, and in the headings, most peaceful countries and least peaceful countries. But then the students are asked to do some research, perfectly reasonable, and they're asked to create a fact file. So the teachers called it facts, what the government wants them to teach, of crime and conflict. And so not only have they got to have a map or an image, but an overview of the conflicts, statistics relating to wars, and crime statistics. Now, of course, any sociologists know that when you talk about crime statistics, you've got to look at how the data is being collected in the first place. You know, are they white-collar criminals, or are they people on the street shoplifting, or whatever? What kind of groups of data do you have? So that's highly problematic. But of course, if you did an overview of conflicts, and this is a very brief lesson, isn't it? It's a 1 hour lesson or whatever. You're not going to have time to go into what created the conditions for the conflict historically. So colonialism, for example, in Nigeria or something that might prevent the development of civil society. So can you see the problems for the teacher trying to get the students to be active, do something worthwhile that you might ask anybody to do, but because there's not enough contextual background, they're in danger not only of not doing something that's accurate to the students or authentic, but also kind of mistaking what we would understand by the word fact, not problematizing the word fact. So when Thomas Kuhn wrote a foreword to a book that was very influential for him, written in 1935 by Ludwig Fleck, The Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, that was the title of the book, he commented that somebody had said to him that when they mentioned the title of the book, the person had said, a fact is a fact. It has neither genesis nor development. You know, if I let go of this, it goes to the ground, that's a fact. And there's no genesis or development in that. That's how people think of facts, isn't it, in that way? Highly problematic in the previous example of a fact file. But if we think about how we were taught what an atom is when we went through schooling, and we would all been given pictures of atoms in textbooks, we were very unlikely to have had the most recent model, I think, the quantum model, where you can't even have a continuity from the outside to the inside, because you've got packets where the energy has to jump from one packet to the next. So the model has changed over time of what an atom is. So the fact of what an atom is dynamic. It's changing depending on how we understand things and the extent of knowledge of the area. So it's very easy to look in the history of science to see how a concept changes over time, changes through history and has different meanings. So the question for me is, what difference would it make if the representation of an atom was taught as a model? Now, you might say to me, all the science classrooms I know, they do teach them as models, but I doubt it. I don't think that's the common practice. It's a tiny little thing. It doesn't have to take more than a few seconds for a teacher to say, this is a model of the atom, not this is the atom, you know, or the way it's written in a textbook. But it makes a massive difference, because by saying it's a model, it leaves space for our responsiveness to reasons. It leaves space for our agency. So Peregrine says something that might seem a bit strange at first. He says, to say what an expression means is not to state how things are. You know, so if I say atoms are like a ball with an orbit, you know, of the outer particles around the inner nucleus or something, that's not saying how things are. What it's doing is it's saying how they ought to be, namely how the expression is correctly used. And there's a distinction there. It might seem like there's no distinction from me saying this is what an atom is. Here's a kind of onion. We can slice it up and see the outer and the inner layers. Or me saying this is a model of how things are. This is how, if you use the term atom, you ought to use it. Now, that could enrage somebody like Nick Gibb, who could say, well, you know, you're leaving open that the students can say, no, that's not how an atom is. You know, it's something else. And obviously they don't have the authority to be able to say that. But what it does do is leaves open for the student that our knowledge of things depends on something dynamic. It's not a static, fixed thing. And in certain areas, in certain subject areas, it's highly open to interpretation. And so that completely changes how students might think about what they're learning. I once was speaking to a student where I was an A-level history student. I was trying to explain to them, they were asked to write about a photograph of the Selma March. and people were walking uphill, earnestly struggling up a incline, and it was a silhouette, a black and white picture. And they were asked to interpret it in history and explain things about how that photograph had been constructed. And I realised they didn't have a concept of representation, of representation. They only had the idea of it's either this or it's that. They didn't understand that it needed interpretation. That's something they would learn at A-level. But the student said to me, why wasn't I taught this all the way through school? Why was I not taught that representations are dynamic? They're models. They're ways of attempting to convey something. They're saying how we ought to apply a particular expression. So, crucially, when we talk about representation, Peregrine says we have the peculiar ability to let one thing stand for another. You know, I can go like that with you, and you can think, is she saying don't go there, or is she blowing us a kiss, or what is it? You know, what she's doing. So we can let one thing stand for another, but it's very difficult to explain in a non-mysterious way how we do it and what the relationship so established consists in. So this is problematizing something we take as second nature. You know, that you open a textbook and it's got pictures and all sorts of things, and they're supposedly explaining something. We don't think of them as representations. Inferentialism brings to light just those aspects of this process which are significant for educationalists concerned with how learners grasp concepts. It confronts the question of precisely what this grasping consists in, what's involved in a student understanding a picture of an atom. Vygotsky is very interesting here because he was at odds with Piaget in many ways, even though he was born the same year, 1896, he died at a very early age, and Piaget lived on till the 70s, and so we had his later work. With Vygotsky, we've only got his very early work. But he says a concept is the result of rational processing of our existence, and it's mediated knowledge of the object. So he's capturing that it's a representation, it's not just a mirror of whatever it's representing. And he says to think of some object with the help of a concept means to include the given object in a complex system of mediating connection and relations disclosed in the determinations of the concept. So that's a real mouthful. What he's saying there is that if you're thinking of something and you're giving it a name, you're thinking of it conceptually, you've got to have it in a system of connections to other concepts. And those connections to other concepts determine what that concept is. They decide the meaning of that concept by its connection to a whole set of other concepts. So that's a very different way of understanding what a concept is than thinking a concept is a representation or a picture of something that it describes, something that it pictures. So I'm going to give you another bit of video now, so we have a little interlude for thinking time as we've got the video on screen. Piaget is very famous for this particular experiment, the 3 mountain task. So many of you may know it. It was crucial because it showed apparently that students were unable, or sorry, I should say very young children, I mean below the age of 6 or 7, were unable to perspective take. Why does it matter to be able to perspective take? Well, the argument is that relates to metacognition, to thinking abstractly. If you can come out of your own view of the world and take another view that's not your own, you have the possibility of abstraction. So he designed a task to see whether young children could perspective take, and it was called the 3 mountain task. It's carried out, I think, in Switzerland or in Geneva. And children were seated at one side of a mountain scene, and they had a doll at the other side, and they were asked what they could see and then what the doll would see. Now, even for us, it's not easy to do, you know, but we can say, oh, the church is on the right side for me, but it's on the left side for the doll, or the house is now on the opposite side from the doll's point of view. And what he demonstrated convincingly was that below a certain age, students or children couldn't think abstractly. They couldn't perspective take. So Margaret Donaldson, who was his student, I'm going to put the video on again. Margaret Donaldson redesigned the task. So in fact, it was Martin Hughes who redesigned the task. He was part of her team. And Margaret Donaldson, I don't know if people can carry on hearing me while you're changing, so maybe I'll just stop for a minute. Well, Craig is saying yes, thank you. But basically, Margaret Donaldson was convinced that Piaget hadn't taken account of everything. Though she was Piagetian and she was working with Piaget, eventually she came to work with a team who redesigned the task. Yeah, and I'm just going to show you the redesigned task. So what she did was, you probably saw it very briefly on that picture, instead of 3 mountains, she had barriers and a policeman and a doll, policeman doll and another doll hiding from the policeman, and the child had to see the policeman's perspective to put the doll in a position where it couldn't be seen. So yeah, you can put that on. I think you could tell from the video what was going on, that instead of the 3 mountains, she's got the barriers, and the child is asked to put the doll where the policeman can't see the doll, and the child can do it very straightforwardly, which suggests that they can perspective take. So when Donaldson explained the different results she got to Piaget, she said it was about context, that people are always in a context. And the child, it was very important for the child to understand the context in order for them to understand what they're asked to do. I mean, it's a very strange situation where you have an experimenter asking you to say what's on the other side of the mountain. But and also she focused a lot on the language that was being used by the experimenter. But my argument is there's a better interpretation of the success that she achieved with the results. And that is that the norms were in place in the second task. The norms guiding what it is that you're doing and what everything means in the context and what you're trying to achieve, the purpose of the task, are explicit, aren't they? They're explicit in one sense that hide and seek is a universal game anyway, so the children would be familiar with it, but they were also familiar with policeman dolls, particularly in the context here of where the experiment was carried out, of the policeman and hiding from the policeman. And so they were able to perform the task. So rather than just saying context, which is a very kind of vague term, isn't it, to say the context was different, I'm suggesting you can bring inferentialist resources to give a much more detailed account. And that is, in the first task, the norms, there weren't norms visible in a sense. It wasn't clear what the purpose of the task was. And it wasn't clear how everything played any kind of particular role. Whereas in this task, it's totally constrained in terms of what the demands of the task are and what the meaning of all the elements are, because in a sense, the norms are visible for the child. So we'll come back to this issue of normativity. So Peregrine again says, meaning is not a thing stood for by an expression, as representationalists would have it, nor is it, in fact, a thing at all. So that's a very strange thing to say. I'm saying these sentences to you and you're understanding what I mean on a certain level. But he says it's rather the role the expression assumes vis-a-vis the rules that govern it. So what he's saying is your understanding of particular expressions is not coming from the expression itself. It's coming from the norms, from the rules that govern the correct application of concepts in the sentences that I'm speaking. Of course, that's a problem then, isn't it? Because your familiarity with these norms is going to be varied in this group. Some of you are going to be very familiar. So when I'm saying particular sentences, you'll have a really good grip on them. And others, the terms will be much less familiar. You won't be thinking about norms in the way that I'm talking about. You might be thinking about sociological norms, a dress or something like that. So you're not going to have quite the same grip as somebody else who's got a grip on those terms being used in a particular way. And of course, that's something we face as educators, isn't it? That we're talking to a group of human beings, all of whom will have different ways of appreciating what a word means. From Bruner's point of view, the fuzziness of language, the ambiguity of language, is a strength. It's not a weakness. It's what allows us to calibrate our actions in the world in very fine-grained ways and apply things in such a way that we can be creative. So here's a simple example, development of word meaning. A child may apply a word in roughly the right territory. So we can talk about that territory as an inferential framework, all the different matrices, the connections of concepts that relate to a particular concept that they're applying. And they can do that without a sufficient understanding to apply it correctly. So dog in a domestic context is applied to the four-legged creature in the place that you live. But they could apply the same term for the four-legged creature in the field, i.e. a sheep. The child's concept use is not yet sufficiently refined. It's not yet committed to the relevant concepts, like lives in a field, makes bar sounds, that would exclude the concept sheep from the concept dog. So the child's beginning to develop a concept. You know, Vygotsky says, when any of us first learn a concept, the development of its meaning has only just begun. It's not something that we get it fully fledged right at the first usage. It's something that grows over time as we flesh out connections to other concepts. So the norms entailing the correct use of a term such as dog are not generated simply by consensus among users, but by the imperatives of purposeful engagement with the world and our ongoing articulation. So the point about these norms is you could say, well, we can just create anything we want to. So let's invent a new word today and let's all start using it. And of course, children in schools do invent new words. I mean, we're all familiar with the word wicked, which it's very difficult to have a kind of Victorian sense of the word wicked now. If I said to you, you're wicked, you know, you would think of it as good. It would be hard to think of it as me telling you that you're evil, because we've inverted the meaning of that word. We've got a new consensus over the correct application of that word in a number of different contexts. But, you know, children came up many years ago. I know there's other words that are better now, but the one that I find difficulty with, the word sick, to say your scarf is really sick, you know, which means they like it for some reason. Whereas all I can have is a visual image around Leicester Square of kind of lumpy things in a liquid on the floor. And it's very hard for me to get that image out of my head to see the word sick in a different way. Of course, if I was habituated to the reasons that constitute that word functioning in a particular way over time, it would just become as natural for me as the word wicked has, you know, where it's very clear to me to think of wicked in a positive way. So to grasp or understand a concept is to have practical mastery over the inferences it's involved in, to know in the practical sense of being able to distinguish what follows from the applicability of a concept and what it follows from. Remember, this is what Brandom is saying is different when a human being turns the thermostat or the thermostat itself turns off. As the learner develops their understanding of a concept, the network of inferential relations constituting the concept changes, and this involves changes in what is entailed by and what follows from the developing commitments of the learner. So it may seem insignificant, these words, they're everyday words like entailed or commitment, but in Brandom's work, they have a technical meaning and they relate to what it is in terms of the inferential connections that we're accepting or not accepting when we apply a term in a particular way. So I'm not going into the more technical aspects of this, but just to say, and this is from Brandom, Kant distinguishes our judgments and actions from the mere behaviour of other life forms, as they are things that we are in a distinctive sense responsible for. They express commitments of ours. So this is me coming back to agency again. when we're talking about learners or a teacher using a representation to try and explain something, to what extent are they opening the possibility of engaging with the different ways that students are understanding that representation? And I know this is very difficult in the constraints of lessons, but that would mean they're engaging with the agency of the learner, what those learners, what commitments they have, like the child was committed to the idea that four-legged creatures are dogs. And then they would need to have that commitment challenged when they realise it doesn't apply to sheep. So judging and acting involves undertaking commitments whose credentials are always potentially at issue. So it's a very dynamic way of thinking about things. When all of us have a discussion, when you ask me questions after us, we'll all be using concepts and we'll use the same word, but we'll be using them in slightly different ways. And those differences will come out as we have a dialogue. We'll begin to see that we have slightly different commitments in our application. So, as Vygotsky said, the nature of things is disclosed not in direct contemplation of one single object or another. This is the travesty of some of the things that people take from cognitive load theory, when they think that to help a weak learner, you must break things down into little bits and then build up to something more complex. That's challenged by what Vygotsky's saying, but in fact, Kirshner wouldn't go along with that either. I've asked him, is he happy with people doing that? And he's not, for obvious reasons. But as Vygotsky says, to develop a concept of some object means to disclose a series of connections and relations of the object with the rest of reality, to include it in a complex system of phenomenon, in a system of judgments in which the concept is disclosed. The role of norms in providing the conditions of reasoning then, students develop responsiveness to reasons, to these norms, in particular knowledge domains, enabling them to take up the commitments that come with those knowledge domains, to know what is being represented, and to be able to explore what commitments to particular relations between concepts entail. That's when you have understanding of something. So, for example, the word force, which is the same in both these sentences apparently, but in physics, it's got one set of inferential connections, but in the sentence, which is the title of the opera, The Force of Destiny, it's got another set of inferential connections, and they're not the same. So the term functions in a different way, depending on which domain of knowledge it's being applied in, the norms that govern how it ought to be applied. I'm coming towards the end now. So dialogue, when we have a dialogue, it involves an ongoing process of social articulation, resulting from the interlocutor keeping track of each other's commitments. So that sounds a really funny thing to say, that if we're just having a chat about something, we might be talking about Trump or something and what he's doing. And the idea is that dialogue, we're actually keeping track of each other's commitments. Sounds a really kind of weird thing to suggest that we're doing. What we are each, in fact, committing to in our specific use of a concept, and therefore what our related entitlements are. So we could be discussing, the concept of freedom and talking about Trump in relation to it. And obviously there's a very different way of thinking about that term if we were talking about it in relation to Donald Trump than if we were talking about it in relation to Marxism, say. It would have a different meaning, it would be functioning in a different way. And as we're talking, we become aware if we're each using the term in a different way. So in the process of clarifying our commitments, we discover what we're actually entitled to, rather than what we at first glance assume. So the act of communication, and Bruner sees this as crucial, tests our commitments, although we might only fully focus on what we're committing ourselves to when an interlocutor challenges our application of a concept. So, of course, we're used to that, where somebody said, well, why are you talking about sovereignty in that way, you Brexiteer or whatever? Why do you think that's what sovereignty means? But actually, the point is, we're doing it all the time in communication, and teachers experience this through the process of teaching, because when you teach, you begin to realise you don't fully understand what you thought you knew. And the reason you understand it is because you have to become clear about what you've committed yourself to in your application of the concepts you're teaching. And in doing so, often you change your commitments. You begin to modify how you're using a concept in a particular way. Here's an example of meaning and knowledge in a common pedagogical practice. So this is a lesson. The students have made posters. One of them's got the word laws on one side. I don't know if you can read the writing. It's got things like socks shouldn't be worn with high heels, don't wear sandals, they're ugly, do not wear crop tops and jeans if you're old, like over the age of 30. And then on the other side, poster, you've got prophecy. Topshop will go bust, Sports Direct will close down, be taken over by JD Sports. I don't know what's actually happened. This was quite a few years ago. This is 14-year-olds. Nike and Adidas will be cheap in the future. I know some of you know which lesson it is, but those of you who don't, can anybody have a guess what this lesson is? Any thoughts?
Is it RE?
Yeah, who said RE? Who was that? I'm interested who said it.
Great.
Craig. How did you realise it was a religious education lesson?
It's because religious people use the word prophecy in a completely different way to non-religious people.
Yeah, so you worked it out. So what's going on here? Well, the teacher's thinking this problem of epistemic access. Are my students, I've only got one lesson on the Bible, you know, in the way that the RE's taught in this country, where you're covering many different religions and many different aspects of them. One lesson on the Bible. How are you going to engage them? How are you going to get them interested in them? I need them to get some concepts from the Bible, Proverbs, prophecy, laws. So I'll ask them to make their own Bible, car Bibles, fashion Bibles, whatever kind of Bible, and use the concept. Remember, the whole thing about Brandom's inferentialism is use, how the concept is functioning. But there's a big problem here, isn't there? Because without the relevant norms being made available to the student, and I mean the norms that govern religious education and how you use concepts in that context, the use they make of particular concepts, demonstrating the particular inferential connections to other concepts they're committed to, will not be governed by the standards of correctness of the subject domain that they study. So the problem here is, are the norms governing the application of concepts in that lesson in relation to a theological text? And you could think of all sorts of creative ways. If only teachers had the time. There's no preparation time for teachers, you know, proper preparation of time. I mean, 20 hours for 1 hour's content teaching. You know, if you had the time, you could come up with some wonderful, ingenious ways of bringing students into the use of those terms within the context of theology. But in fact, what's happened is the students have drawn on the norms that they're habituated to in their normal lives, the norms of consumer society. And that's why it's about businesses going bust, or, you know, kind of on a trivial level compared with the Bible context, you know, rules about what kind of clothes you should wear. So this is trying to illustrate why normativity matters, why norms being in place matters. And I'm trying to relate that back to what makes us distinctively human, to this fantastic power we've got of instituting in place the things that we're going to respond to. We can collectively do that together. But if we don't recognise that very different way of our relation to the world, then we're not going to take account of it pedagogically. So the role of norms in providing the conditions for reasoning. Students develop responsiveness to reasons, in particular knowledge domains. Did I read this already? Have I gone backwards? Enabling them to take up commitments, to know what is being represented, and to be able to explore what commitments to particular relations between concepts entail. So there's a problem with privileging the representational over inferential in teaching. The assumption that the initial awareness of a concept is grasped first by a representation, and then you can start doing things with it and sort of digging in and getting a deeper understanding. So the argument here is that that kind of assumption neglects that any meaning attributed to a representation arises from the significance attributed to it in human activity, and that human activity involves reasons as well as causes. So just to end, but I'm going to flip back to a slide that I missed right at the beginning. Coming back to this issue of agency, I see agency in terms of having an inferentialist orientation to the knowledge domain on the part of the teachers and the learners. You know, so them understanding that picture of an atom, not as a mirror of what atoms are, but as a tool, as a concept that we can use as a model, that then we can see how it's functioning in relation to what it's trying to convey. So the meaning of a concept, rather than being fixed, is fleshed out by the inferential connections that constitute it. And as these connections change, so the meaning of concepts alter. And we can see the process by which knowledge itself develops as one of inferential articulation. So there's lots of wonderful examples, particularly in science, where you can have at the same time two concepts functioning alongside each other, being applied in different aspects of research, although they're talking about the same thing, the gene. So using these resources opens up a way to a more fine-grained account of pedagogic practice and of subject knowledge, one that recognises the agency of learners. And I just want to skip back to the first slide because I missed it by mistake when I was trying to find out how to move the slides. Because I started with the slide about the OECD saying agency is really important and we need to prepare our students so that they can really flourish and develop and show their agency. But there's a problem with how we understand agency. And this is, so I was starting off challenging the idea of representation. But there's a brilliant book, it's an old book now, by Macpherson called The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism. And he talks about human essence as viewed as freedom from dependence on the wills of others. So my freedom is something that's going to be constrained by your freedoms or be affected by your freedoms in some way. And freedom is a function of possession. That's why he calls it the political theory of possessive individualism. The individual is viewed atomistically as essentially the proprietor of his own person or capacities, owing nothing to society for them. So you can trace this kind of thinking through Locke or through Hume or Hobbes, a way of thinking about what freedom is in modernity. But this contrasts with a very different view of the individual, the view of an individual's self-conscious awareness in terms of recognitive, reciprocal interaction with others. And that's a Hegelian sense of freedom, that we're free because we can recognise as equal to our own other people's consciousnesses. And in fact, that's what Brandom's interested in. He's interested in this constant calibration of meaning that's going on because we do take on in dialogue what somebody else says, and it allows us to reflect on our own application of concepts and how we're using ideas. So here, individuals' capacities are actualised in social interaction through social practices that form the historical development of knowledge. So that's just one example, like the force in physics and the force in destiny. You've got the word freedom. We all think we know what it means. But actually, it's in a very different network of concepts, depending on whether you've got the Donald Trump version of freedom or a Hegelian concept of freedom. You're understanding those terms in a different way. And so meaning, remember, what Peregrine was saying, is not something that's held in the word or in the representation. It's due to the functioning, or Brandom would say, it's due to the use of the term. And that's what we need to bring students into if we're going to bring them into particular knowledge domains. Okay, sorry, I went on a bit longer because of all the logistics, I think.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Jan. It's absolutely fascinating to be let into this world of inferentialism and relation to education. We have some time for questions now. and there may be questions coming up in the room or online. Online people, if you would like to raise your hands, we can kind of scroll down and see if you have a question. People in the room, if you have a question. So I'll just open the floor with one that's come up, and just because I'm new to this topic, but I have researched quite a lot around agency and education through other philosophers. And this connection you have with inferentialism and agency, to me, seems to reconfigure representation through an abstraction, so you're talking about the model which enables people, let's say we're talking about human animals, to see around the issue and therefore to interpret it in different ways. And then that in itself, that enablement of interpretation, brings in choice and agency. If that sounds something similar to...
So it is similar,
yeah.
but I would want to add a caveat. And again, to kind of make it more precise in inferentialist terms, in the terms I'd want to do. I'd want to say, on the one hand, it opens up the recognition that when any of us engage with the word, if I say the word cat, you've all got a different image in your head now of what cat means, whether it's a black cat, a big cat, your tabby cat, whatever, So when we use the word, everybody's interpreting it in different ways. But the crucial point is we share public language. And so there are norms that are governing how we ought to apply the word. And then we can challenge that, subvert it, change it, modify it over time or whatever. But the beauty of this is it's not just a kind of subjectivist position. It's not just down to an individual, in a sense, possessive individualism, as though I've got my kind of notions of cat and you've got your notions of cat, because both of our notions of cat are dependent on public language and the norms that govern how that word is applied. And then we can take an orientation to that. But in a sense, we've got to we've got to kind of comply with the norms to the extent that we then do something with them.
So that there's a collective meaning created through there being a norm, which then is brought into
yes, yeah, but even there's a danger with the word collective in the sense that Brandom is not saying that meaning or truth is to do with consensus. It's not about a consensus, but there's a recognition, depending on the domain, that there's an ongoing articulation. So obviously, in terms of atomic theory, that's going to be slow over decades or centuries. But if we were having a discussion about cooking something tonight, it would be on a totally different micro level. But it's just that normative aspect has to be in the picture. And that's like, often people think of freedom in, like I say, the possessive individualist. Why did the teacher get the students making their own Bibles? She was trying to validate their own interests, their own desires, their own motivations. But actually, their own motivations and desires were those that were fashioned or shaped by consumer society, weren't they? Because they predictably came up with things that we could put down to consumer society in another context they wouldn't come up with. So we've got to understand our responsiveness to those norms as well.
Thank you.
I'm just keeping an eye on the chat here, and I've got a question from Eleanor, who I'm assuming is a science teacher, and she asks a very practical question. If there was one thing that I could share with my team in order to improve teaching science, what would that be?
Oh, goodness, I'm not a science teacher. I'm here in the room. It's Turner, but I think what it would be was this point about modelling, in fact, this applies to any teaching, making students aware that we're dealing with representations. And to get a grip on representation, it's just the tip of the iceberg. You've got to know the whole rest of the iceberg underneath. And then, of course, in different subject domains, getting a grip on that may be more constrained than in other subject domains, or more dependent on particular norms being instituted in a particular way. But it's just understanding that dynamic sense, understanding these things and models. How you do that, people often say, well, how are you going to be an inferentialist? How can you redesign all your lessons? But I think teachers can just do it in the ways that they talk and the ways they recognise in their speech very easily that, you won't all get a sense of this word. You know, this is a new term that I'm introducing here. I haven't got time today to go into it in detail, but maybe somebody can come back next week and look it up on AI or something, you know. So just kind of little things can make a difference. Not teaching things literally, that's the important thing.
Yeah, there's a couple of people down the side.
So thank you so much for this. It's been really interesting. And I'm going to ask a question, very simple, plain language. What you're saying, but one thing I'm thinking is the fact that I think a lot of people, especially like the way you talk about consumerism, a lot of social media like kind of leads people down a certain route of belief or a mindset or a mind framing. Sometimes in a way it's kind of a bit oppressive in a sense, and we see that like it's influencing like paradigms in a big way. So this seems like a really good opportunity to deal with that. But then there's the thing that I'm battling in my mind is understanding how this doesn't, like how people don't go away and start like building a knowledge of themselves and like basically like they'll build like through I don't know delving in deeper of themselves. They're just like, this is what truth is and nobody else can convince me of anything else otherwise because this is this, if that makes sense. Like how do they?
Yeah, so in a way the dogmas that we might all be subject to, you know, you're absolutely right. There's the most brilliant series I recommend to you. You can get it on BBC iPlayer and YouTube, called The Century of Self by Adam Curtis, where he talks about the last century and how the nephew of Sigmund Freud, Edward Bernays, started public relations and how to manipulate populations to get them to think in a certain way. So you're absolutely right that that is what's going on. But of course, that's where when the OECD says it wants our students to have agency, I'm saying it's not just about freedom in the Donald Trump sense. It's about getting them to be able to open up the concepts that they have and the teacher finding the space to enable that to happen in a classroom. And I think if that became a more common practice than going through school and getting a literal teaching of facts without understanding the genesis, the history or whatever, you know, then you're just habituating people to not being reflective in that way. So you're quite right to pick up that issue. And I think even a programme like Question Time, often it's so impoverished what's going on. There isn't a kind of more profound engagement with a topic. It's more what I call yah boo. One side says yah and the other side says boo, you know, and you're not really getting to do so. So you all have to become philosophers.
Question.
Maybe a statement. Thank you. That was very interesting, Jan. I was Jan's student, so I think I'm kind of situated in the norms to some extent a little bit, but I still don't have a full understanding of the topic at all. But it kind of made links to what I have experienced in a teacher training when I was observing practitioners. There tends to be an underlying assumption that there is an understanding already when they teach the children that will then provide the children the knowledge that will allow them to understand the topic. And there's quite a lot of that assumption in many teachers. So like even in terms of handling different words in a classroom, like you were talking about the dog or different animals, would be coming from assumption that the child would understand. And then also moving on to the next topic very quickly as well, preventing them to kind of immerse themselves in what is being discussed, which I think to some extent can prevent the children from understanding and entering the space of reason and not coming up with, discussions about Adidas or Nike in an RE. So yes, just very interesting. Thank you.
And of course, I agree with you. Unfortunately, I wish the curriculum review was looking at this because I think it's the interrelation of pedagogy and knowledge. Yeah. It's not just you can deal with knowledge and then think about the pedagogy. Yeah.
But one kind of possibly one dim question and then one thought to share. So one of the things I'm trying to come to terms with is this idea about being entitled, how the kind of shared meaning gives you an entitlement. I wrote down something that was on one of the slides about dialogue is about keeping track of each other's commitments, what they are each in fact committing to in their specific use of the concept, and therefore what their related entitlements are. So I just want to understand a bit more about what you mean by what we're entitled. Does it mean what we are allowed to believe, think, or say in the process of the dialogue? Is that what you mean by entitled there?
So it means something more at a micro level. It means the direct implication of what your commitments are. So there's an example I sometimes use of a advisory teacher talking about a child who will only see triangle sat shape, a symmetrical triangle, as triangles, and won't accept the ones that are, I think it's equilateral versus isosceles or something. You know, so therefore they're only entitled to engage with things that are that shape when they use the word. That's what follows from what they're committed to. It's not a very clear example. I could give you, if I had time, a much more spelt out example. But if you use democracy in a particular way, then there will be particular entitlements that will follow from that. And then if you use it in a different way, there will be other things by entitlement, in a sense, I mean, that will follow from it. So Michael Sandel, the philosopher, often did programs on I think it was on Radio 4, you might be able to find them, where he'd get an audience and he'd get a debate going, like, should students have fees, you know, not have to pay fees in universities? And he'd get people taking different positions, but then what he'd do is unpack their positions for them, make explicit what they have committed themselves to if they take a particular position. And what normally happens if you unpack somebody's commitments is our position changes. Because you begin to say, actually, hang on a minute, if I stick with this position, then this follows from it. You know, this is what it entitles me to. You know, it might be over funding of the NHS or something like that. So you begin to see fully what follows through from the way that you're applying the concept. And that then makes you revise the concept. And this is the beautiful thing that, I mean, James Britton writes about in relation to Vygotsky, that when we write, if we write an essay or we write something, when we put pen to paper, we have the opportunity to engage with our thought, externalised. And when we look at what we've written, we might think, that's not quite what I meant. I need to kind of adjust that sentence. And then when we start adjusting it, we realise I didn't mean what I meant. Yeah. You know, so then we begin to reflect on, actually, the reason I can't get this into a sentence that I want is because I didn't quite mean what I thought I meant. And it's the externalisation that makes explicit what we're committing to. So you had something else to say?
No, it's just a thought, and again, it might not be very relevant, but I get quite excited about inferences, and although I'm really learning about it, I don't really know much about it at all. But sometimes I think there may be a bit of a crossover between the underpinning ideas around inferentialism and the kind of conceptual grasp of certain subject-specific vocabulary. And I was thinking about what that science teacher was asking, and also about what you were saying as well. So I've seen lessons where, I'm not a science teacher myself, but I have been a teacher for a long time. And I've seen lessons, science lessons, where the children are dealing with things like photosynthesis, phototropism, and so on. And if you sneak around the classroom and speak to the children, you find that they don't actually know that when we use the term photo, it means something that's connected to light. And if they got that concept of photo, they would know that, and you know what synthesis is, then you know that photosynthesis is using light to make food. You know, it's that sort of thing. And I mean, I've also been in lessons about chromatography and found out that the children don't know the whole ancient Greek thing about colour and all those sorts of things. And I don't know whether that's inferentialism or whether that's just kind of subject specific.
So it's what I'm arguing for. And I should say, by the way, that I'm talking about Brandom's inferentialism, but of course I'm taking his ideas in a kind of rough and ready way and applying them to education in the way I want to apply them. You know, I think I could have a discussion with him and convince him that the applications are reasonable, but this is my version of, you know, my interpretation of how I can use Brandon's work on inferentialism in that particular way. But I think you're absolutely right that we underestimate meaning. And even with the force in physics and force in destiny, I've got an undergraduate course and I asked the students, do you know what force means in physics? Obviously we were all taught it. I couldn't really remember it very well. And all they could say, I think I'm right in saying this, is E equals
MC squared.
No, MC squared. Not E. Is it E?
It is.
Oh, it is E. Yeah. E equals, but they couldn't say anything else. They couldn't say what any of those terms meant or how they related. And so they've got through the exam because they can come out, and there's a lot of research, isn't there, on science undergraduates when they get their degrees actually not understanding the science, not being able to use it. So that's the point about understanding and our agency that's being left out of the picture.
We have an online question.
No, this is my one. But
Yeah, we had. You wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, obviously you haven't asked the question yet.
there you go.
What I was going to ask was, if like teachers are meant to carry this out, and obviously given the very varying quality of teacher education right now, what do you think would need to happen, especially in a teacher's like own certain paradigm, for them to be able to get to a place to be able to do this work?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question because Dylan Williams, well known for saying it's very expensive and resource intensive to improve a teacher's subject knowledge. And that's why he was saying put the emphasis on assessment for learning. Don't try and improve that, you know, but you can understand governments haven't got the investment. But I think this having an inferential story, what I call orientation to the knowledge domain, is just getting off first base. You don't have to have the answers like Anne was saying. You know, you don't have to know how you should teach it or what you should teach. But I think if you think of representations in these ways, rather than in the common sense way that we normally think of them, that immediately changes your talk a little bit or how you present something a little bit. It's just very tiny things can make a big difference, I think, to learners if they have a teacher who recognises their own vulnerability, in a sense, in relation to the knowledge that they hold as well.
I noticed there's a couple of people online, Richard and then Dennis.
Right. Do you want to ask your question, Neil?
Let's
Are
go to
you
the
okay to
people
go
online.
to,
Yeah,
to Richard? Richard, would you like to unmute?
Hello, can you hear
Hi,
me?
Richard.
Hello, Jen.
Good to hear you. But just to say, Richard Marsh was known for his fantastic interviews with philosophers, and I recommend you Google his, look at them. But for that reason, Richard, I'm going to say, please keep your question to, you know,
Very
30
short.
seconds something.
Yeah, it's very short, very sympathetic to a lot of what you've said there, Jan. Perhaps you could you just explain a bit more about the relationship between what you're saying, inferentialism, and truth claims, especially in the context where perhaps you've got controversial subjects, like you might have a very religious community who believes in creationism, and you've got a science lesson. How I know you've got an answer to this, but I think it might be interesting to hear how you'd approach that from this position.
Maybe I haven't thought it through enough, but I think of truth in the way that Brandom does, the ongoing articulation of reasons. So I don't distinguish between what somebody would say in a religious context to what somebody might say in a physics classroom, in the sense that if they've got an inferentialist orientation, then you're understanding everything they say in a particular way. And that doesn't mean that you don't appreciate the validity of their claims in the context that they're talking about them and the way that they're using terminology. Does that answer your...
Yes, I think that's right. I was just wondering, though, I think at the moment there's quite a few issues like that where there is a controversy, and a decision has got to be made about whether in the science curriculum, you know, creationism should be brought in or not. And in Texas, they're bringing in creationism now. I'm wondering whether inferentialism actually is a little weak on this in terms of a pushback, or whether you actually think it's fine to have that.
By the way, I should be careful to say that it doesn't mean I don't think some things are wrong. But, you know, I'm not saying that everything is right or true. But what I am saying is, just in the same way that where Michael Sandel might unpack what commitments somebody's made, I think you have to do that the same thing with claims that people make, what claims they're making, on what basis, what kind of assumptions have they taken into account, what's the status of the norms that they're responding to, all those kinds of things, in order to appreciate the validity or the consistencies or whatever of a particular claim.
And I wonder if we can just try and squeeze. We're going to go a little bit over, that's all right, because we've got a couple more.
Yeah, if people are happy to go
Is that all right?
5, 10 minutes over.
But that's a big topic, isn't it? But it's good to have it raised. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, we've got 2 more questions, so let's see how succinctly those questions can be presented in our short amount of time. Dennis, would you like to ask Jan a question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. I enjoyed your presentation. I was thinking about the difference between gnoseology and epistemology, and how we might, within pedagogic practice, which has been hammered by control and centralisation and so on and so forth, that we may place, not to reject epistemology, obviously not, but to pay more attention to gnoseology and to the thisness of learning. And I can emphasise this by a brief anecdote. When I was teaching many years ago, the science teacher came up to me and showed me a pupil's book where he'd written about an experiment, but he'd written it in the form of a story. And the science teacher said, I can't accept this because it doesn't conform to scientific method. And that, while she was speaking, I was thinking of that in terms of these norms which teachers are often subject to, as opposed to the gnoseological forming of knowledge within existential situations of learning, which then open up the possibility to invent new norms.
Okay, can you spell that term, because I should know what it is. I just looked it up in AI and it just told me the study of noses. It's often seen as knowledge, but it relates very much to knowledge as it occurs in the moment, in the space of practice, as opposed to the word eology, as opposed to formed knowledge. Yeah. So this is the point. Look, hang on. I'll come back. You better move on. Somebody's at the door. Okay, I'll come back to you with an answer.
I think this is the last one.
Yeah. Thanks, Dennis, for that intervention there. And we'll definitely
come back
look into gnoseology. So let's have Craig.
I'm back now.
Oh,
shall I just very quickly respond? Look, sure. The point is that any kind of way that a student tries to make sense is something that a teacher should engage with. But the teacher's also got the responsibility to initiate the student into what it is to do science and the place of that kind of engagement. So I know if you looked in the history of science, you know, I think in the discovery of the DNA, the book, The Double Helix, you know, they talk about having an image in a dream of a snake, you know, and getting the helical shape of the DNA. So you would want to recognise for the student, yes, imagery and other ways of making sense of things are useful, and they may feed into your work as a practicing scientist at some point in terms of your thinking and imagining things when you're trying to get a grip on a model. But you've still got to be trained into what it is to do science or to write up a scientific experiment. And so the teacher has a responsibility to make those norms visible to the student, otherwise they're failing them.
Yeah, I'm not disputing that at all. I'm just making the point that in the experience of pedagogic practice, one can come across situations which then change the norms of that practice.
I'd love to have a really good example of that, of something where you're challenging the norms you know, so science teaching takes a different form afterwards. But obviously, science teaching has changed over decades. But yeah, I don't know whether it would be initiated by a student, but maybe it would be. And John Yandel's got some lovely work on students making contributions in lessons, which suggests something original to the teacher that they wouldn't have thought of, and they felt that other using English would not have thought about. So I don't want to, by the way, I don't want to ever deny any contribution that any human being makes in a situation if they're serious about it. But I'm saying the teacher has a responsibility to both recognise it but position it in relation to the subject area that they're trying to bring them into. And that could be controversial, by the way. But the teacher can be open to that.
I mean, in my own space of art, of course, it's quite different, because that often happens, where students will do something which is, you know, mysterious or different. But then norms are very different there.
Yeah, but there's a difference, isn't there, between a teacher saying, why are you doing that? That's a waste of time, get on with the science, and somebody actually engaging with something, but then positioning it according to them being a teacher in a particular discipline in relation to the lesson that they're doing. So that the student's got a way of understanding it in relation to whatever they're doing.
Okay.
Brian, that's another, this is setting a lot of hairs running his
I think this would be another whole discussion between you and Dennis.
One last.
We've got another question
we
here.
can squeeze that one in.
Yeah,
I think that would be
let's hear from Craig, please.
Right.
Craig, do you want to unmute?
That would help, wouldn't it? Certainly. Thank you, Jan. That was fascinating. I have many questions, but I'll restrict myself to asking just one of them. I really like the way that your pitch for inferentialism can be understood in a very simple warning about the danger of vagueness, and that it's applied to people getting excited when they say when they hear Donald Trump say something like "Make America Great Again." But I'd observe, apropos your observation about question time, that when an English politician says very little about a policy and then says, well, we're going to have a very robust policy, nobody in the audience starts booing or throwing anything, and observing the word robust means absolutely nothing, and that no one's arguing for a non-robust policy. And along that line of thought, the idea being, if you reverse an idea, you can often find out whether something is being vague. I wanted to ask, to set up my real question, which is, what's the opposite of the school who are arguing for facts? So we know that Hirsch and Nick Gibb are very big on facts. So that's the setup of the question. And the question is, if you were trying to understand Trump's defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, you'd find him talking about how little he likes democracy. So I read this in the paper and I was completely confused, because when I was, you know, being brought up, America pushed this idea of itself as the country that spread democracy and the rest of the world didn't have democracy. So the idea that a Republican who's very proud to be an American, obviously, was against democracy in some sense and had bad things to say made no sense. And it later made sense when I got into his Republican understanding, which is that the Constitution says what America should do, not modern Americans. So in the sense of not wanting to ask modern Americans how they want to change the law, he's not a Democrat. So all of that to say, as inferentialism points out, trying to understand the meaning of one person's concept involves sometimes trying to understand their whole mental world. So my question is, how is that possible if not through learning more facts, or learning, if you can indeed call, you know, Hegseth's conception of Republican philosophy as a fact? So my point is, if we're going to get children to understand concepts in a deeper way, how are we to do it if not in learning some sense facts? And who on the other side of the Hirschian table, and I'm not a huge fan of Hirsch, who on the other side of the Hirschian table is offering some solution for that problem in the way that you've laid it out?
So of course I think students should learn facts, but I think what some ministers have thought facts were are not what they are. You know, so a fact has genesis and development. And if you want to get a grip on a fact, like Anne was talking about, if you want to understand chromatography, it might help to know some of the etymology of the word and to understand its history. And then you can get a proper sense of why the word is functioning in the way it does function. So this isn't, you know, this is why when I first set up the kind of unsettled debate, about knowledge and pedagogy, I was saying both sides have got a problem. Both of them are in a possessive individualist conception of freedom and agency. Both of them have a representationalist element driving them. And so, therefore, they're not getting to grips with what the real issue is in relation to agency. So I don't have any problem teaching facts, but those facts are not what people think they are. If I'd had time, I would have shown, and you can Google it, Feynman, the physicist Feynman, and I think the thing's called What's in a Name, or The Name of a Bird, where he says when you know the name of a bird, you know nothing about the bird. And then he says he doesn't bother with names for things.
I thought that was, isn't that a reputation of the chromatography point? It means we end up learning the Greek words for things, but not understanding, what chromatology is, let alone the scientific method.
Well, depending on what you're doing when you're looking at the etymology, you're looking at the functioning of the word. That's the point. I'm trying to get people to look at the functioning, not the actual name, whether it's X or E equals MC squared or whatever it is, but actually how the thing is functioning. And that means you're getting a grip on it.
I think that's a really great point to conclude with, Jan, in terms of the functionalism of inferentialism and what it's actually doing for learners, and the meaningful learning that you're talking about, creating agency for them, with them. So thank you so much for being with us today and for presenting your estimable knowledges in our Known and Unknown series. And if you want to go back to this recording and hear more of it, we will have recorded it. It will be on our Centre for Arts and Learning YouTube, and then on our webpage, so that you can listen again. So thank you so much, Jan.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody who joined online.
Thanks to everyone online.
Thank you. Thanks, Jan.
Thanks.
There we go. We've stopped recording now, so everything else is on
Thank
record.
you.